Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. Welcome to this episode of What Matters Today, where we delve into the complexities of the current crisis between Israel and Lebanon. As tensions escalate, Lebanon faces profound challenges to its stability, governance, and ability to provide essential services. In this episode, we explore how the conflict is reshaping the Lebanese state, examining the government's response, the factors influencing its decisions, and the critical role of public opinion, especially concerning Hezbollah's involvement. We'll also consider how Lebanon's position at the heart of regional tensions might lead to shifts in alliances and potentially transformative changes within its own political landscape. To help unpack these pressing issues, I'm joined by Christiana Parreira, Assistant Professor of International Relations and Political Science here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Christiana joined the Institute in 2022, following her role as a Post-doctoral Associate in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University and a Pre-doctoral Associate with the Middle East Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School. So how has the current war affected the Lebanese state in terms of its stability, governance, and ability to provide basic services? Has this crisis exposed any particular strengths or vulnerabilities within the Lebanese government structure?
So I think it's important to note the state that the Lebanese state was in prior to this war. There was, I think, a sort of all-encompassing governance crisis that preceded this war that really began in 2019,
right,
when currency crisis basically devalued the currency and this was coupled with essentially capital controls that left most people unable to access their bank accounts for the most part. And this is the situation that the government's been dealing with. It's been operating on a fairly limited budget since. And at the same time, for over 2 years, there has been no president. The president is elected from within the parliament, and this has not happened due to essentially elite infighting.
Right.
And because there's no president, there is no prime minister, and there is no government. There is an acting government, but this government, again, is constitutionally very limited by what it can do. So these two features, this governance crisis and this financial crisis, have really limited the state's ability to respond to the war.
And can you walk us through the Lebanese government's response to this conflict? What factors, both internal and external, influence its policy decisions in such a tense regional situation?
So the government's main goal right now, and the main thing that it's been working on doing, is dealing with displaced people. That is, people who have been internally displaced by the conflict. And estimates are rough because of the ongoing nature of the situation, but anywhere between a fourth and a fifth of the Lebanese population have been displaced. And the vast majority of those have been displaced from the south or the southern suburbs of Beirut into other parts of the country. So this has involved, for example, many government buildings, including schools and some hospitals, being turned into shelters for displaced people. And then, of course, the government also has to deal with the run-on effects of how to deal with education when a lot of your public schools have been turned into shelters, for example. So the government has officially activated an emergency plan involving a joint response and fundraising efforts by the United Nations and other international organizations. This has resulted in some limited fundraising, although probably not adequate to meet the needs of the ongoing conflict. So, for example, one sort of fact that points to this insufficiency is that the local government of one of the cities that's been most affected by this conflict, that is Saida, it's located in southern Lebanon, estimated that its needs as a result of the conflict are about $1 million monthly.
Wow.
Since the start of the conflict in September. And they've so far been given, and this may have changed, this is a fast kind of moving situation, but they've so far been offered $50,000 by the government of Lebanon. And so this is kind of speaking to the fact that there are massive needs as a result of internal displacement, casualties, and infrastructural destruction that the state simply is not able to meet, even so far with international coordination. At the same time, the state has also done some other things to sort of try to ease the hardship, given that it has very limited capacity to act, given that it lacks a government.
Right.
So, for example, the central bank has loosened some of these capital controls that I spoke of. People are now able to access a slightly higher number of their savings in US dollars per month than they were before the crisis. This is essentially central bank engineering to try to ease the hardship. But again, all of these measures, I think it's fair to say, are really clearly insufficient.
And given the impact on the population, how has Lebanese public opinion responded to the crisis, especially regarding Hezbollah's involvement? Is there a shift in public sentiment toward Hezbollah's role in Lebanese politics and security?
We have some data from shortly before the conflict in Gaza started that speaks to this with regard to Lebanese public opinion specifically. So before the conflict, according to a study done by the Arab Barometer, which is one of the primary sort of polling initiatives that surveys all countries where it's possible to survey in the Middle East, including Lebanon, there was very, very high, over 90% support for Hezbollah and specifically for its armed resistance against Israel. This is the question phrasing within the Shia Muslim community in Lebanon.
Right. Okay.
So speaking on that community specifically, they were very, very supportive of Hezbollah's role in the region. Again, this was polling done very, very shortly before the October 7th attacks and before the expansion of the war into Gaza and then Hezbollah's role in that. Among other sects in Lebanon, so Sunni Muslims, Christians, and Druze, opinion was much more divided and much more critical of Hezbollah's role as an armed actor stationed within Lebanon, operating within the region. So in those communities, it varied, but these were numbers somewhere, between the 20s and 40s in terms of public support. At the same time, so that's one side of it, right? At the same time, there was a really widespread, I think, sentiment in Lebanon as this war came to involve Hezbollah in 2023 that Lebanese did not want to be involved in a war. This was very, very clear. And this was a really widespread sentiment that you could see frequently being expressed on social media. This is very natural, right? People did not want their lives to be affected in the way that they now have been. And now that Lebanon has come to be involved in this conflict, I think you see a real polarization along the question of root causes and why Lebanese came to be mostly unwillingly involved in this conflict. And the polarization now maps on to whether or not people think that Hezbollah should continue to exist within Lebanon, specifically as an armed actor. There is one camp that thinks that there has never been a greater justification for Hezbollah's weapons because of this attack by Israel, because Israel is now actively attempting to, on a limited basis, even occupy land in Lebanon. People say, well, now we need an armed resistance. On the other hand, there are people who point out, I think with some justification, that Hezbollah's role as an armed actor within Lebanon is in fact what led this to happen. Right. I think it's increasingly clear that there is no military solution to this conflict and that there has to be some sort of durable political solution. And I think that is this question of whether or not Hezbollah can and should keep fighting is now a source of polarized but quickly evolving public opinion.
Interesting. And with Lebanon historically positioned at the crossroads of regional tensions, how might this conflict influence the broader political dynamics in the Middle East? Could we see shifts in alliances or new patterns of regional engagement?
Yeah, I think the overarching point to make here is that we're at this sort of critical juncture, and in sort of nerdy social scientists speak by that, I mean that a lot of options in terms of regional dynamics that seemed like they were really off the table a few months ago are now back on it.
Okay.
And not just back on it, but things that would have never been thought possible now seem like they might be possible. I think there are a few possible trends in no particular order and without endorsement. One is that I think given the extent to which organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah have been militarily weakened over the past year, and in particular since September of this year, there is a real possibility that their main regional sponsor, Iran, will decide that the costs of maintaining these groups militarily are simply too much. And while Iran may continue to sponsor these groups ideologically and a bit materially, they may back off of these efforts. And that may shape both Iran's power in the region and sort of regional alliances and trends. Another trend that seems to be developing, that was developing before the events of last year and this conflict, is that the Gulf states, by that I mean the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, are clearly positioning themselves to eventually broker some sort of deal that ends this violence, that ends this conflict, and that potentially promises, I mean this in really broad terms, some sort of peace involving the Palestinians. This may not end up guaranteeing sovereignty or statehood in a meaningful way for the Palestinians, but it seems that the Gulf states are really trying to position themselves as the key brokers of that arrangement, whatever that arrangement might look like. And I think the third sort of possible trend in terms of the region involves the United States. The US elections being held today. I think there's a very real possibility that the US may also become actively involved in seeking a diplomatic solution in a way that it hasn't been recently, for very different reasons, depending on which administration comes to power. So Trump, because of his isolationist approach to foreign policy, and Harris, because this has become a bit of an albatross for the Democratic Party and for the Biden administration.
And for my final question, considering Lebanon's economic and political challenges, do you believe the current conflict will push the country towards any significant political changes or reforms? And how might this shape Lebanon's path forward and its role in the region?
I guess I could interpret this question in a few different ways. I mean, the first thing I'll say is that Lebanon is very clearly, and this is not particularly revelatory, but Lebanon is clearly at a crossroads unlike anything it has seen as a state since the end of its civil war, which ended in 1989. And I say that because Hezbollah, as it stands, and again, things are very quickly evolving, but as it stands, Hezbollah has been militarily decimated. Its leader, who is arguably one of the most, within some communities, venerated, certainly the most controversial figure in the country, has been assassinated, along with its entire leadership structure. But on the other hand, I don't think this war will independently serve as a sort of wake-up call around which all sorts of different elites will suddenly be united. Like, we have to sort of band together and work for the sake of Lebanon. I think that I'm sorry to sound cynical, but I think different parties and elites within Lebanon still have very fundamentally different interests in terms of how this conflict plays out. One pathway forward is that Hezbollah will be in a semi-permanent way militarily weakened. And what will its political power look like after that? This is an open question in Lebanon. This has arguably been the most single consequential political faction in the country, insofar as it has existed as a popular party that also has an army behind it.
Right, yeah.
And I think if this is no longer the case to the extent that it has been since the Civil War, the structure of inter-elite and inter-party alliances in the country will undoubtedly change. And I can't speak to how that will happen, but I can't imagine it not evolving in a significant way. The removal of an unarmed non-state actor from that equation, from that political equation, it may open up new opportunities for brokerage of a more effective governing coalition, more empowered opposition movements, and more investment in and legitimization of state institutions. Again, I'm not predicting any of these things will happen, but it opens up that possibility. That said, a lot of the structural features of how Lebanon functions, how governance functions, or more like usually doesn't function, a lot of that will remain the same. And so I hate to end on that note, but yeah.
Well, Christiana, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of What Matters Today.
Thank you so much.
This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.